The phone rang on a steel gray Tuesday in Boston, rain needling the windows, matching the hollow in my chest. It was 3 days after Grandpa Samuel's funeral, and the grief still felt like an open wound. I expected a client asking for tweaks to the Franklin Tower schematics. Instead, my mother's name, Cynthia, lit up the screen. I nearly let it go to voicemail. "Ethan," she said, her voice as crisp and devoid of warmth as the chilled Chardonnay she favored. There was no, "How are you holding up?" no softness at all. It was straight to business, as always. "Mom, I just wanted to let you know things here are being handled," she stated, a vague, dismissive turn of phrase that set my teeth on edge. "Your grandmother is fine. She's a strong woman. She'll figure something out." Figure something out? The words landed cold and sharp. My grandmother, Margaret, had just lost her husband of 55 years. The man she had built a life, a home, and a family with. What was there to figure out? She was supposed to grieve in the comfort of her own home, surrounded by a half-century of memories. But a bad feeling settled in. For the past several months, every call with Grandma had felt strained, her words clipped whenever I asked about my parents' or Grandpa's health. I had offered to leave my architectural projects in Boston and come home to Burlington, Vermont, a dozen times, but she had always insisted I stay focused on my career. "He'll be all right, sweetheart," she'd say, but the tremor in her voice betrayed a deeper fear. I learned Grandpa had died from a neighbor's condolence post, not from my parents. The sting of that discovery was a betrayal that still felt like a physical blow. Something was deeply wrong. I hung up the phone, a cold resolve settling over me. I booked the first flight out of Logan. The drive from the airport to the old Victorian house on Maple Street was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Every landmark, every familiar bend in the road, was steeped in memories of Grandpa Samuel. He was a retired history professor, a man of quiet dignity and unwavering principles who taught me how to read a compass, how to identify the constellations, and how to build a respectable birdhouse. He was our family's anchor. Grandma was its soul. She was known for her boundless kindness, and for apple pie people still talk about. That house, their house, was the only place that had ever truly felt like home. My parents, Richard and Cynthia Carter, were far too preoccupied with their ascent up the corporate and social ladders in New York City to be bothered with raising a child. My childhood was a series of boarding schools and summer camps, punctuated by brief, sterile visits where I was lectured on my perceived lack of ambition for choosing the creative path of an architect over the lucrative world of finance they inhabited. It was my grandparents who had raised me, their home a sanctuary that always smelled of cinnamon, aging paper from Grandpa's library, and the clean scent of laundry dried in the Vermont sun. When I turned onto their street, my heart plummeted. The house looked vacant. The vibrant marigolds and rose bushes Grandma Margaret tended with religious fervor were choked with weeds, their withered heads bowed in defeat. The windows were dark and unwelcoming in the bleak November afternoon. It felt like a ghost had passed through and stolen its warmth. And then I saw her. My grandmother was sitting on the top step of the porch, huddled inside a thin, worn coat that was no match for the biting wind. A single battered suitcase stood beside her. She looked small, fragile, and utterly lost. The sight of her, shivering and abandoned on the doorstep of the home she had filled with love and laughter for 5 decades, broke something inside me. "Grandma." My voice was a choked whisper. Her head snapped up. Her eyes, usually so full of light, were clouded with a sorrow so deep it seemed bottomless. She tried to muster a smile, but her lips only trembled. "Ethan, what are you doing here, honey?" She attempted to stand, but her legs buckled. I rushed forward, catching her frail body in my arms. She felt as light as a bird. "What happened? Grandma, what's going on?" I asked, my voice shaking with a fury I could barely contain. She wouldn't meet my gaze, her eyes fixed on some distant point over my shoulder. Tears clung to her long, silver lashes. "Your mother. Cynthia said I should find somewhere else to grieve," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the rustling of dead leaves. "She said this house isn't mine anymore." I stared at her, the words failing to compute. "What? That's insane." "She said your father inherited it, that the will was very clear. She said I should have made plans for a life without Samuel." Her voice cracked on his name, and a single tear traced a path through the fine wrinkles on her cheek. A blind, white-hot rage, an emotion so potent it was almost dizzying, surged through me. I guided Grandma to my rental car, settled her in the passenger seat with the heater on full blast, and then turned back to the house. I stormed up the steps and tried the front door. Locked. I pounded on the heavy oak, the sound echoing in the unnerving silence of the street. After a moment, the door opened a few inches. My father, Richard, stood there, a smug, proprietary look on his face. He was dressed in a cashmere sweater, his Rolex glinting on his wrist. "Ethan, we weren't expecting you," he said coolly. I pushed past him into the foyer. The house was cold, sterile. On the living room walls, the cherished family photos of my grandparents' wedding, of my first birthday, of countless neighborhood gatherings, had been taken down. In their place hung large, impersonal modern art prints. My mother was perched on the sofa, swirling a glass of red wine, the picture of detached elegance. "What is wrong with you?" The words ripped from my throat, raw and loud. "You kicked Grandma out. Your own mother. You threw her out into the cold." My mother took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine before answering, her voice dripping with condescension. "Don't be so dramatic, Ethan. She doesn't own the house. Your grandfather left it to us in his will," my father added, adjusting the cuffs of his sweater. "It's ours now. The paperwork is all perfectly legal. Grandma lived here for 55 years. I roared, my voice echoing in the cavernous, newly impersonal space. "She built this home with Grandpa, piece by piece. Her name is on the original deed." "A technicality the new will supersedes," Richard said, waving it away. "Frankly, Ethan, we need the space. We're thinking of a complete remodel. These old Victorians have potential, but the layout is terribly dated." The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of it stole my breath. They weren't just taking a house. They were erasing a life, erasing my grandparents' legacy, for the sake of granite countertops and an open-concept living room. They had turned a sanctuary into a display of greed. Standing in the hollowed-out shell of my childhood home, a pure, venomous hatred boiled like acid. That night, I checked Grandma Margaret into a comfortable room at a nearby inn. I held her trembling hands and looked into her tear-filled eyes. "I'm going to fix this, Grandma," I promised her, my voice low and steady. "I swear to you, I will make this right." But it wasn't just about fixing it. It was about justice. It was about retribution. I would not rest until I had dismantled the life they had built on a foundation of lies and cruelty, brick by stolen brick. This wasn't just about property. It was about indecency. And what they had done in the name of inheritance was about to cost them everything. My crusade began not with a bang, but with the quiet rustle of old paper. As an architect, I understood that the strength of any structure lies in its foundation. I needed to examine the foundation of my parents' claim, to find the cracks, the weaknesses, the rot hidden beneath the surface. I spent the next 2 weeks immersed in the bureaucratic heart of the county. The archives became my office, the scent of dust and decaying parchment my constant companion. I meticulously sifted through land deeds, bank statements, old tax filings, and safety deposit box access logs, tracing the history of the house on Maple Street. The initial findings were just as I remembered. My grandparents, Samuel and Margaret Carter, had purchased the plot of land in 1967. The original 1967 deed listed them as joint tenants with rights of survivorship. But 2 years ago, while Grandpa's health slid, a transfer into a short-lived living trust severed the survivorship and converted title to tenants in common without Grandma realizing it. Over the years, I found records of several home improvement loans and a second mortgage to fund an extension, all of them co-signed by both Samuel and Margaret. They had built this house together, not just with lumber and nails, but with shared dreams and mutual debt. But then, as I combed through more recent records, the picture grew darker. About a year ago, when Grandpa's health began its steep decline, my father started making frequent trips to Burlington. I found a new will, drafted just 6 months before Grandpa's death. It was a cold, clinical document, a stark contrast to the thoughtful, generous man I knew. In it, Grandpa Samuel supposedly bequeathed his entire estate solely to his son, Richard Carter. It was all there in black and white. The house, the savings accounts, the retirement fund, even Grandma's own jewelry, which had been passed down through her family for generations. Everything. My father had preyed on my grandfather when he was at his most vulnerable, weak, ill, and likely disoriented by his medication. The signature on the will looked shaky, a pale imitation of Grandpa's once firm hand. It was a legal, but morally bankrupt, coup. Yet, as I sat there in the sterile silence of the records office, a memory surfaced, a beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness. I was 10 years old, helping Grandpa in his vegetable garden. We were planting tomatoes, the rich Vermont soil cool and damp under my fingernails. He was explaining the importance of strong support stakes for the growing vines. A house is built on 2 pillars, Ethan, he had said, wiping a smudge of dirt from his nose with the back of his hand. Never let anyone tell you otherwise. And no matter what happens, I've made sure your grandma, our Margaret, will always be safe. This house will always have 2 pillars to hold it up. 2 pillars. The phrase echoed in my mind. The will was one pillar, a new, rotten one my father had erected. But where was the other? I knew my grandfather. He was a meticulous planner, a historian who understood the importance of primary sources and contingency plans. He would have built a failsafe. I just had to find it. My search turned into an obsession. I knew the will gave my father access to Grandpa's main bank accounts, but Grandpa was old-fashioned. He believed in tangible assets, in things you could hold. A safety deposit box. The access log showed Samuel Carter had a safe deposit box at the downtown branch of Vermont Mutual Bank, and the signature card listed a C. Margaret Carter. The next morning, I took Grandma to the bank. The manager, a prim man named Mr. Abernathy, was hesitant at first, citing privacy protocols. But when Grandma produced her key and a valid ID, he had no choice but to relent. He led us into the vault, the massive steel door swinging open with a satisfying thud. He retrieved box number 312, a long, slender metal container, and placed it on a table in a private viewing room before discreetly closing the door behind us. My hands trembled slightly as I watched Grandma insert her key, then the guard key, and turn. The lock clicked open. Inside, beneath neatly bundled stacks of old war bonds and Samuel's honorable discharge papers from the Army, was a thick manila envelope. Grandma lifted it out, her fingers tracing the familiar, elegant script on the front. It simply said, "For Margaret." Inside was the second pillar. It was a quitclaim deed dated the day after that coerced will, signed and notarized, conveying Grandpa's half to Margaret outright, making her the 100% owner on his death and bypassing the will entirely. The house was, and always had been, hers. But that wasn't all. Beneath the deed was a portfolio. It contained documents for a hidden, irrevocable trust established by my grandfather 5 years prior. It was set up to activate upon his death for the sole benefit of Margaret Carter. I scanned the summary page, my eyes widening in disbelief. The trust held $1,850,000. The final piece was a handwritten letter, sealed with wax. It was addressed to his attorney. My grandmother's hands shook as she opened it. "David," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I fear my son has acted as I suspected he might. Richard and his wife have been pressuring me to alter my affairs. My mind is not as sharp as it once was, and in a moment of weakness, I may have signed something I should not have. Let this letter serve as my final testament on this matter. The enclosed quitclaim deed is to be considered my true and final wish regarding my home. It is Margaret's sanctuary, as she has been mine. The trust one established is to remain untouched and is for her care alone. Protect her from their greed. They do not understand that a family's legacy is not measured in dollars, but in love and dignity. Do what is right. Your friend, Samuel." We sat there in the quiet, sterile room, the evidence of my grandfather's love, foresight, and quiet defiance laid out before us. He had protected her after all. He had built an unshakable second pillar. Now, it was my turn to use it not just as a shield, but as a weapon. Armed with Grandpa's final wishes, I sought out his attorney, David Harrison, a kind, silver-haired man whose office was filled with the comforting scent of leather-bound books. He greeted my grandmother with a warm hug and listened intently as I laid out the documents on his large mahogany desk. As he read his old friend's letter, his expression hardened from sorrow to a steely resolve. "Samuel was a wise man," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He saw this coming. Richard and Cynthia's behavior is not just immoral, It's fraudulent. He looked at me, his eyes sharp. What they've done constitutes elder abuse and malicious intent. We can sue them into oblivion. I have a better idea, I said, a plan beginning to form in my mind. A beautiful and terrible piece of architectural justice. I don't want to just sue them. I want them to feel exactly what Grandma felt. I want to take the home back, but I want them to hand us the keys themselves. Harrison leaned forward, intrigued. I outlined the strategy. We wouldn't reveal our hand immediately. We would let them continue their arrogant preparations, secure in their supposed ownership. Simultaneously, using a portion of Grandma Margaret's newly accessible trust fund, we would act. The plan was audacious. Through a shell corporation, a completely anonymous legal entity named Green Mountain Holdings, we would make an all-cash offer on the house. Richard and Cynthia had already listed it with a high-end real estate agent, eager to liquidate the asset and fund their next lavish venture. They were over-leveraged, as Harrison's preliminary financial checks confirmed, and a quick, hassle-free cash sale would be irresistible. I played the part of the faceless corporation's representative, communicating only through email with a clipped, professional tone under a pseudonym. The agent gushed about my parents' plan for a sprawling modern condo in Miami. They were so blinded by their greed and arrogance that they didn't question the anonymous buyer. They saw only the dollar signs. After brief haggling, they accepted an all-cash offer of $890,000. Within 3 weeks, the transaction was complete. My parents, Richard and Cynthia Carter, signed the closing documents, legally transferring the deed of 24 Maple Street to Green Mountain Holdings, a holding company wholly owned by a trust whose sole beneficiary is Margaret Carter. They had, with their own signatures, sold my grandmother her own house back, using her own money. The irony was exquisite. A week later, with the new deed securely filed with the county, it was time to set the stage for the final act. I called my mother. "Mom," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "Grandma and I would like to have you and Dad over for dinner. This Thursday, a family dinner, to talk things through." There was a moment of surprised silence on the other end. "Oh," she finally said, a hint of triumph in her tone. "I see. So you've both come to your senses. Of course. We'll be there at 7. On Thursday evening, the house was filled with the warm, inviting aroma of Grandma's legendary apple pie baking in the oven. We had spent the day restoring a small corner of the home to its former self. We put their old wedding photo back on the mantelpiece, and Grandma set the dining room table with her best china, the same plates used for decades of Sunday dinners. She sat quietly in her favorite armchair by the fireplace, her hands folded in her lap, her expression serene and unreadable. She was no longer a victim. She was a queen about to reclaim her throne. At precisely 7 o'clock, my parents swept in, exuding an air of magnanimous royalty. "Well, this is a nice surprise," my father announced, looking around the room. "Glad to see you're being civil. We were just discussing the remodel. We found a fantastic contractor. He thinks we can knock out this wall," he said, gesturing toward the kitchen, "and install a marvelous granite island. The floral wallpaper will have to go, of course," my mother added, wrinkling her nose. "It's dreadfully dated." They spoke as if we were guests in their home, as if their victory was absolute. I let them preen and posture, their arrogance a monument to their own ignorance. I served Grandma's pot roast. They ate heartily and offered condescending compliments. Finally, when the plates were cleared and the pie was cooling on the counter, I placed a crisp, brown manila envelope in the center of the dining room table. "What's this?" Richard asked, picking it up with a bored expression. "It's an eviction notice," I said. They both laughed. A sharp, ugly sound that held no real humor. "You're joking, right?" Cynthia scoffed, taking a sip of wine. "Ethan, this isn't funny. You can't evict us from our own home." "No," I replied, my voice as cold and hard as polished stone. "I can't." I paused, letting the silence stretch. "But the new owner can. The owner is evicting you. The house is legally hers again. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises." My father's face went slack, the color draining from it until it was a pasty gray. That's impossible. We sold the house to a holding company. Green Mountain Holdings," I said, sliding over the paperwork. "Owned by the Margaret Carter Trust." One by one, I laid out the evidence, the quitclaim deed, the trust documents, and finally, a copy of my grandfather's handwritten letter. This is all legal, airtight, and has been filed with the state. And if you even think about resisting, Mr. Harrison is prepared to file a civil suit for elder abuse, fraud, and infliction of emotional distress that will financially ruin you for the rest of your lives. The reaction was immediate. My father stood up, so quickly his chair crashed to the floor. My mother let out a strangled scream, her face contorted in a mask of pure fury. She snatched her wine glass and hurled it against the wall, where it shattered, spattering the dated floral wallpaper with a blood-red stain. "You think you can take everything from us?" she shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. I looked at her, at the woman who had given me life but had never given me love, and I felt nothing but a cold, empty pity. "No," I said softly. "You already did that. You did that to the woman who gave you everything. I'm just giving it back." That night, for the first time in months, my grandmother slept peacefully in her own bed, in her own home. My parents, as expected, tried to fight. They hired expensive lawyers who filed motions and injunctions, but they were fighting a battle that was already lost. They had nothing left to argue. The court not only upheld the legality of the quitclaim deed and the sale, but, in light of Grandpa's letter and the circumstances of Grandma's eviction, ordered them to pay over $750,000 in damages for acting in bad faith and attempting to defraud a vulnerable elder. Their world collapsed quickly. To pay the judgment, they were forced to sell their summer home in the Hamptons. Their accounts were frozen, their credit ruined. The story of their callousness, leaked through town gossip and legal circles, destroyed their carefully curated reputations. Their so-called friends, the ones they had entertained at countless charity luncheons, vanished like smoke. 3 weeks later, on a misty Saturday morning, a tentative knock sounded at the door. I opened it to find them standing there on the porch. They looked haggard and defeated, their designer clothes seeming oddly out of place in their new, diminished reality. They fell to their knees on the welcome mat, tears streaming down their faces, begging, pleading for forgiveness, for help, for a place to stay. Grandma Margaret appeared behind me, wrapped in her favorite cardigan. She looked down at her son and his wife, her expression not of anger, but of a deep, profound sorrow. "I have nothing more to say to you," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "May God forgive you. I am not sure I can." With that, she turned and walked back into the warmth of her home, closing a door on a chapter of her life forever. We brought the house back to life again. We tore out the weeds and replanted the garden with bright marigolds and fragrant roses. The warm scent of cinnamon and baking once again filled the hallways. Grandma resumed her Sunday dinners, the table now surrounded by neighbors, old friends, and people who truly cared. With a significant portion of the trust fund, she established the Samuel Carter Teaching Scholarship at the local university, creating a tribute to the man who believed in knowledge and quiet dignity, a legacy of giving, not taking. As for my parents, they moved into a cramped, 2-bedroom apartment in a forgotten corner of Queens. No one visited. They became ghosts in their own lives, haunted by the memory of the warmth they had so carelessly thrown away. Revenge wasn't fire and fury. It was the quiet return of dignity. It was the sound of my grandmother humming in her garden and the sight of the porch light flicking on at dusk. I never went back to Boston. I moved my architectural firm to Burlington, setting up a small office downtown. Every morning, I have coffee with my grandmother on the front porch, watching the Vermont seasons change. We talk about everything and nothing, her wisdom a comforting anchor in my life. Every night, we turn on the porch light, just as Grandpa Samuel always did, a small beacon shining in the darkness. Because the simplest lesson held true, a lesson my parents never learned. Family is not paperwork or blood alone. It's about love, loyalty, and who shows up to sit with you in the dark when everyone else has walked away.